I think I was charged with giving an introduction and a brief overview of complexity theory. And so I thought that it might be a good idea to begin with a clarification, because a lot of times, especially in the regular press, people say it's complicated and it's complex, and those of us in complexity theory really think of it as very different. So first I want to talk about complication, or if you want to call it complicatedness. It's an ugly word, but so is complication. And I think of complication as situations where there are very entangled, jumbled, messy parts that are all jumbled together. I tend to use the word parts and constituents when I'm speaking of complicated system. I tend to use the term component when I think of complex systems. So one characteristic of complicated systems is that the relations between the parts and how they interact are usually linear. They are usually cause and effect relations that produce additive effects. I tend to think of a good example as sand grains jumbled together, massed together, become a sand dune. The characteristics of the sand dune are merely additive compared to the individual grains of sand. They are magnitude, they're just size and so on. And you can find it very difficult to keep track of what's where in a complicated system. And so that is one reason why it makes sense that people use the term complicated or for these kinds of processes. So, but I think what's critical is that in complicated systems, there are no mutual dependencies between the parts or the constituents of the mass or the heap. The elements do not change in virtue of belonging to that mass or that heap. There are no mutual dependencies. In particular, there is no phase transition that turns a complicated mass of stuff into a complex system, because there are no qualitative properties, qualitatively novel properties that emerge as a result of a phase transition. So if you think of complicated systems as linear, their output is smoothly proportional to the input. You double the number of sand grains, you double the size of the sand dune. The properties of the whole, therefore, are sums. But in the case of complex systems, you have a nonlinear phenomenon where the output is discontinuous with the input. And if I may give examples, I think, for example, of a situation where elements synchronize. Once elements interact in such a way that they synchronize, or that the whole begins to oscillate, you have a totality that has qualitative differences from the sum of their parts. And usually the synchronization and the oscillation emerges in a discontinuous phase transition. So think of a synchronized pattern of behavior, and the properties of that synchronized totality are different. What do I mean by that? Synchronized marching by soldiers on a bridge can collapse the bridge. Synchronized stomping in a stadium can collapse the stadium. Oscillatory behavior can become a predator-prey dynamic. And that's because there are interactions between the, in this case, components. And so I would want to argue that ecosystems, because of these interdependent, constrained interactions, become complex, and they are not complicated. They have characteristics that are greater than the sum of their parts. Now, what I want to really emphasize, which is kind of most of my work for the last number of years, is that my training is in philosophy, and philosophers and mechanical Newtonian science has focused on, those of you in Europe have probably studied Aristotelian efficient causes. Those of you in the United States probably haven't. But Aristotle considered efficient causes energetic transfers. So if you think of the forceful impact of cue sticks hitting cue balls or nails being hammered into wood, those are examples of efficient causes. And what I think changes complication into complexity is the activity of constraints. And I want to define constraints as conditions or factors. I find these two words seem to be used a lot now. Whenever people get stuck and they find they can't identify mechanical Newtonian causes for totalities, they slip into terms like conditions or factors. So let's call constraints conditions that raise or lower barriers to energy, matter, or information flow without themselves directly transferring energy. So that's what makes them different from efficient causes. Among my favorite examples are timing. Timing is extremely important, and complex systems usually are, usually are characterized by oftentimes timing. So when you think of a kick, kids learn to kick on playground swings, and they learn that the timing is really important to get the swing to swing. The point I'm trying to make is that a timing is a constraint. It is not an efficient cause. The timing does not impart more energy into the process than the kick itself. Here's another example. The vasculature of an organism, our blood and lymphatic network, does not impart energy directly. It merely channels and organizes that energy flow, but it is not an efficient cause. And in particular, catalysts and feedback are very important. What they do is they link separate and independent processes such that they become conditional on one another. That's obvious in chemistry, right? Or in feedback, the circularity of iteration or recursion or feedback loops links the output back to the beginning of the next stage of the process. And what happens is that they all become dependent on context. A coherent interdependence is generated thanks to enabling constraints. So I will call enabling constraints those context-dependent constraints that weave together relations among parts or between parts and their context. So these coherent totalities that have characteristics that are greater than the sum of their parts emerge as a result. So enabling constraints self-organized, interdependent, coherent coordination dynamics. And this coherence, I believe, generates novel information. And that, I think, is the difference between complexity and complicatedness. A side effect of the process is that complex systems are really embedded in their context. They're not just dropped or plunked into their context the way a sand grain is plunked into what was an incipient sand dune, and neither the sand grain changes nor does the sand dune acquire any novel, qualitatively novel property as a result of that relationship. This brings up what in philosophy is a mess, and that is the concept of mereology. Mereology is sort of the bête noire of philosophy and of modern, read Newtonian science. Efficient causation, as we said, assumes linear causality. What that means is that in philosophy and in Newtonian science, wholes are nothing but the sum of their parts. In particular, wholes do not create novel interdependencies organized as what the neuroscientist and cybernetician McCullough called heterarchies. You know, I use that word because the word hierarchy is also a mess. So when we talk about wholes and parts and wholes, everybody thinks immediately hierarchy. But the problem with the term hierarchy is that it brings all sorts of baggage with it. In particular, it brings the baggage of the assumption that there is a top level and that all the relationships go one way from the top down to the component parts. But what I want to point out in so far as constraints and complex dynamical systems is that there can be relations of constraint among components at the same level of organization. For example, different species that belong to the same ecosystem. But there is also a top-down causality whereby the interdependency with the qualitatively different component that is different from the components themselves do exercise control on their component. So I want to talk about interlevel relations as being relations of constraint. Interlevel relations are usually not relations of energetic transfer. So I hope so far so good. But if not, let me give you an example. Catalysis, I just suggested, is a constraint. A catalyst in a chemical reaction does not participate in the process. It merely accelerates it. So let us just, as a schematic illustration, assume that A is a catalyst that speeds up and makes more likely the occurrence of another catalyst, B, a reaction. It's the output of a reaction. It turns out to be another catalyst. And that B, likewise, as a catalyst, accelerates the likelihood that C will happen. And that in turn, C closes the loop, if you will, and accelerates and makes more likely the production of A. What you have here is a visual illustration of a non-linear process that self-reinforces. It becomes self-sustaining. And interestingly enough, one can argue that processes like metabolism, like endocrine stability, like the immune system, like neuromuscular dynamics, like perception, are all higher level properties that emerge out of the closed loop interaction among catalysts. Why do I call this a constraint relation? Because look at what often happens in the case of these processes. Let us suppose that you have the same organism performing metabolism, but all of a sudden, you ate a brownie, a chocolate cake. And now what that means is you have a different condition that oftentimes means that more insulin has to be emitted. So imagine that instead of A producing B or catalyzing B, it will generate or catalyze D, which would then catalyze C. The point being that the metastability of the metabolism is achieved, is accomplished, is preserved, even though it did so through a different pathway. This is very different from mechanical processes. So what was originally A, B, C can turn into A, D, C, meaning that one characteristic of complex system is that they are metastable. That they are multiply realizable. In other words, different pathways can generate the same emergent property, and conversely, the same path under different circumstances. Say, in a sedentary situation, you should not be producing that much insulin as you do when you just had a chocolate brownie. So complex systems, one of these part whole and whole part relationships is that the emergent properties of the whole can be carried out, can be accomplished through different component pathways. And that makes the emergent property, I would want to say, causally powerful. But of course, in efficient causality, there's no such thing as wholes exerting efficient causes on parts. So let's suppose that you look at it this way. When you talk about mechanical systems, twice the forceful cause usually gives you twice the effect. Twice the grains of sand give you twice the size of the sand dune. In the case of complex systems, the same input can produce qualitatively different output, and different inputs can integrate into the same output. Living systems do this routinely. Internal and external signals, be they nutrients, temperature, if you're fatigued, if you ate the brownie, are processed, if you will, selected and reacted to in terms of their role in accomplishing and maintaining that overarching dynamic equilibrium. And I would want to say that the word context also implies the past. If you are in one set of circumstances, you might be able to process that brownie with less insulin than if you are stressed, than if you're overweight, than if you have a history of stressful reactions, and so on. So what is very curious is that the emergent properties of the ecosystem become the variables that matter. For example, in the case of the human organism, the organism will process a lot of these internal and external signals with a view towards, does this warrant inflammation or not? Does this contribute to metastability, or is it a destabilizing signal? And that is because the triangle I presented earlier can nest. Imagine each one of these is one of the triangles I mentioned earlier. So each one of these is adapting and modifying itself to keep the function that is its emergent property metastable. So one of these might be the metabolic system. One of these might be the inflammatory system. One of these might be the digestive system. And just as A, B, and C closed their loop of constraints to produce the emergent property, you can have all of these become linked as well, such that Manfred Eigen and Schuster called this a hypercycle, because just as each one of these individual dynamics preserved its functionality by changing its components, the hypercycle itself can alter itself to maintain what you might call homeostasis. See, so this is metabolic stability. This is immunological stability. This is inflammatory stability. Then overall, what you have perhaps is the homeostatic stability of the organism as a whole. Another example, rather than homeostasis, could be proprioception. You know, that sixth sense of where your body is in space. You know what that gymnast during the Olympics called the twisties? Well, the twisties is sort of the phenomenal tag of proprioception. It tells you where your body is in space. So I would say that proprioception, for example, is probably one of these humongous hypercycle that implicate the entire organism, the context in which it is currently located, the context it came from, you know, where your body was in space a second ago, and so on. I would also suggest that cultures, be they an organization's culture or a social, full-fledged community, a culture, combines social stability, social dynamics with psychological dynamics, with economic dynamics, with geographic environmental dynamics, with religious dynamic, and you can keep adding them as much as you want. If you will humor me here, I'll try to go this a little bit quickly. This is one of my favorite images, and it's from Monteville and Mocio from 2015, but Moreno and Mocio in their book, or Biological Autonomy, also illustrated. Imagine that this is time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, time 5. Imagine that you start out with, you know, A and B produce a catalyst. This is an energetic reaction that produces a catalyst. Now, under different conditions, let us suppose that this catalyst contributes to this chemical reaction, which produces this catalyst, and this happens simultaneously, so it produces this catalyst. What I am trying to suggest here, I'm going too fast, but what I'm trying to suggest is that just as you saw that earlier slide, becoming a functional, very complex whole, this can be a closure of constraints that keeps the system whole. And I think here you can see what I call the hierarchical relationships. This is a higher level set of constraints that become metastable, in contrast to the components that make it up, but which can vary. Please notice that C3 can be produced by this reaction, but it could also be produced by this reaction. So you have a multiply realizable dynamic as I was trying to illustrate. The interdependents have relational properties that keep them together, and therefore I would want to argue that those interdependent relational dynamics function as governing constitutive constraints that exercise control top-down from the wholes to the parts. All right, now I think I'll give you a break.
To jump or not to jump? That's the question these squirrels in Berkeley's eucalyptus grove seem to be asking. Researchers enticed the free-roaming squirrels with nuts to examine how they leap and how they land. Capturing all those squirrel hurdles on high-speed cameras, they then took all kinds of measurements to better understand the squirrels' amazing maneuvers. The researchers changed the flexibility of the branches, the length of the gap squirrels had to clear, and the position of the landing perch. And the squirrels adapted with surprising creativity. Not just doing their amazing grabbing, their amazing swinging, but on flimsier branches, deciding to run less and jump farther. And even more surprisingly, on the most flexible rods, it took just 5 tries to learn to stick their landing spot on. No faltering, no swinging. And to reach that higher, farther perch? Parkour. Bouncing off the wall to adjust their speed and reach their nut. Along with using those unyielding gripping skills, not one landing lost. Impressive feat, you might say. Berkeley scientists hope to build these squirrely techniques into new, smarter robots, advancing robotics, you guessed it, by leaps and bounds.
Yes.
What I'm trying to suggest is, think of what is going on in that squirrel as it learns. What I am suggesting it is doing is it is adjusting its constraint dynamics to take into account the context in which this is happening at each time, to the point where it can even begin to use that wall. And the reason I wanted to use that video is because that wall is almost like a good illustration of D, of my other catalyst that assists it in getting the task performed, so that the squirrel, a living being, organizes a task space, if you will, in terms of which then all the lower level processes and dynamics and components become interdependent and adjusted such that they carry out that overall task. So again, complexity requires constraints that generate these complex multi-level parts to whole interdependencies. Once they entrain, once they synchronize, the individual processes change the likelihood of their occurrence, conditional upon the interdependencies in which they are embedded. And at that point, then the complex wholes, WHOLES, become the governing constitutive constraints that maintain and preserve that system. So the hypercycle becomes the governing constraint that modulates, regulates, and otherwise controls the goings-on in the individual processes. Zoom back further down, each one of these then becomes the governing constraints of the components of that one as well. Okay, so let me change a bit. I've got about 5 minutes to go. Think of the rules of chess as constraints that set up the playing field we call a chess game. What do those constraints do? Again, the rules of chess do not move the hand of the player. They are not efficient causes. They simply lay down the settings of which moves are permissible and which are not. The rules of chess are background constraints that are so stable that they are, you can call them constants. The players take them for granted. I don't know if you all remember having read the example in Doug Hofstadter's book, Gödel, Escher, and Bach, where he points out that an experiment was done where they took a grandmaster and they showed him or her an image for just a few seconds of a game in progress. It's important. It's a game in progress. The image is only shown for a very short period of time. And then they asked the grandmaster to duplicate, to replicate what they saw. What's fascinating about that example is that the grandmaster will often place the individual pieces, the rook, the pawns, and so on, in very different positions on the board than they were placed in the image that was shown. But the grandmaster usually replicates the strategic position of that game in progress. And by the way, if these are randomly placed pieces on a chessboard, the grandmaster will say, I can't do this, this makes no sense. So the fact that my question is, what does the grandmaster see? And as I said, if the grandmaster does not see the individual pieces of the board as individual pieces on the board. Otherwise, the grandmaster would duplicate the positions of the individual pieces on the board. The grandmaster seems to be able to see the chessboard in terms of relations, in terms of constraint dynamics, not in terms of the physical location of the piece. So what I'm suggesting is that the cognitive interface of the grandmaster has transitioned, and that's the reason they're a grandmaster and not me. They now view the relationships in terms of a system-wide parameter, a functionality. Call that strategy. And notice how strategy is multiply realizable. The same strategic position can be actualized, realized by different locations of the pieces on the board. So strategy is flexible. It is a view of a constraint structure. It is not a view of the individual physical pieces. So it is because that the grandmaster can view strategy as a metastable dynamic that the grandmaster can therefore perceive opportunities, threats. These are emergent properties of the totality that individual pieces don't have. There is no such thing as a threat of an individual piece absent that piece's relation to all the other pieces on the board. So to get to the stuff you guys are interested in, I want to argue that interfaces are enabling constraints that generate and maintain these kinds of complex dynamics. Interfaces critically negotiate the relations between levels of organization. Remember, I said a little while ago, interlevel relations are not energetic relations. They are relations of constraint. So interfaces are the constraint mechanisms whereby these organizations are negotiated. In organisms, cell membranes, the eardrum, are examples of nature's interfaces. What do these interfaces do? They filter, they recode, they reformat, they select, just as ABC selects A, B, D to back to A, such as to carry out the functionality of the whole. And therefore, interfaces determine the selection criterion in view of which the function will be satisfied. So I'd like to suggest that in a sense, APIs are like membranes. They are, as interfaces, they set the rules whereby two applications will communicate. They act as enabling constraints to facilitate the transduction, the translation of signals coming in one format into the internal dynamics of the system on the other. So how do we manage complex systems? We don't do that by command and control, energetic power relations. That doesn't work in complex system. Or you can destroy the complex system, but you will not either create a complex system through power, or you will not be able to generate a phase transition in a complex system through power. You do that by adjusting and enabling the governing constraints, their relations, such that the interdependencies with each other and with the context change. I don't have time. I'll go over prairie grasses and chaparral if anybody asks during the question and answer session. But what happens is that in doing so, you can expand the adaptive space of the system so that you can handle more inputs than you could otherwise. Like the chess grandmaster, the API is able to handle relations between the outside and the inside, and thereby, in a sense, creates an expanded ecosystem that incorporates both. And I'll close with this image because I really like it. This is a standard epigenetic landscape that Conrad Waddington formulated, I don't know, 50s, 40s, I don't know. But imagine if you only thought in terms of energetic power relations. All people would think of is pushing the ball here to counteract gravity and try to get it over this hump. But if you look at the right-hand image, you realize that it's all these underlying constraints that are creating the landscape, that if you were able to adjust the constraints that produce the landscape, you would change the topology of the landscape and the system might go in the direction that you wanted it to. So the suggestion that complex system has is you're better off trying to manage an ongoing complex system by focusing on the constraints that underpin or subtend the obvious surface phenomena than it is to try to change it through powers. And one of my favorite examples, here's what Science 1.1 tends to look at. People think, oh, I want to get to those hills. I'll build myself this nice, rigid, stable structure. Oh, maybe I'll add oarlocks, make it even easier to maneuver, or I'll add sliding seats and make it even better to get to the other side. But look what happens when you change the context. What happens is nobody looks at the context. Nobody looks at the way the context is influencing the overall dynamic as a constraint. And so this is not going to get you very far. What you need is a flexible set of governing constraints, such as a raft, that will get you over a different kind of context. So anyway, that I think is the end of what I would like to say right now. All right, I hope, well, Lil, I went over half an
That
hour.
doesn't matter.
No, that's not.
It's well
Sorry.
worth it.
Jabe is on now. Sorry, Jabe.
He can't
Marc.
go.
Where do we
Yes,
start?
absolutely. Beware when our context changes, so must our systems.
Yeah, I haven't seen actually any questions in the chat. So, guys, if you have any questions, now's the time.
I think everybody was just watching with bated breath, like seeing the grandmaster explain complexity in you.
No, I tried to get back to interfaces to show the relationships between level. See, natural science and philosophy have never dealt with interlevel relationships, especially between parts and wholes and parts, because the assumption of natural science and philosophy was the wholes that appear as a result of energetic linear causes are aggregates. They are nothing but the sum of their parts, so they are epiphenomenal. They have no power. They have no powers to influence their components or their context as such. So whatever characteristics there are reducible. So psychology is reducible to biology. Biology is reducible to chemistry. Chemistry is reducible to physics. And so if you find a theory of everything, will solve. And my argument is no. At each stage here, you have emergent properties. And those emergent properties, as emergent properties, will control, regulate, modulate, and so on, the components that make it up.
We have some questions from the
Audience.
Yes. We have one from Adi. I'll go for the first one, Marc. So
ahead.
interfaces are placed on the border of a systems of
Yes.
systems, or can we say they define the border of the system?
Both. I think both. Because much to Trump's chagrin, boundaries of complex systems are not just rigid walls. They can be changes in rules and regulations and constraints, and how fast the cycle characteristic of that level of organization goes to completion as opposed to the embedding context in which it is located. And so when you see a discontinuous change in rates, for example, usually that signals you're at the border of a transition between levels. Mm-hmm. So I think boundaries serve as both. Rate changes and these kinds of differences in constraints serve as both boundaries and the dynamics of the system.
Marc, do you have one that you can pick from the... There's a lot of activity happening now in the chat. Sorry.
Okay, so Rebecca asks, so while we can see interfaces, it is much harder to see other constraints in software systems.
Yes.
Any thoughts about how we can approach this dilemma?
Probably very indirectly. And perhaps here the standard notion about the way to manage a complex system is through small-scale interventions. Because in a sense, if you try a small-scale intervention and you see what changes, you might find that you are identifying some of those inflection points in the interactions among components or between the system and its environment. And therefore, you can at least be alerted to the presence of those constraints. I think in the case of business and organizations, a lot of times the rules of the game will oftentimes give you hints as to what is going on, who can do what, and how does this work. I use in the new manuscript an example from Allen and Starr that I really love, and as a former academic, it's dear to the heart of academics, and that is, you can have a discussion among a whole bunch of faculty members that It can get really heated. It can get very upsetting, but nothing's going to happen unless one of those in the argument is the department chair with authority over the others. That's when you will know that relation is a relation of authority and not a relation of power, because even if they came to fisticuffs, nothing's going to happen. But it could very definitely happen that the person in authority, and how does that person affect and influence the faculty member? How does the department chair affect and influence faculty members? They do so by tinkering with the constraints, right? They will change the schedule according to which tenure will be granted. They will change access to financial resources to travel or purchase books or computers or whatever. That's the way. It's by changing the constraints that the embedding context will affect the embedded component. Conversely, the embedded faculty member, if that is a Nobel Prize winner, they can just turn around and say, all right, I'll take my grant with me. And so at that point, what happens? You've got a blurring of the hierarchical or heterarchical relationship, and what used to be a contributing, a component Holland has all of a sudden become the sister hierarchy or level to the chairman, because they're as powerful as the chairperson. So that's the way you see the relationships, and I would suspect that's true in commercial firms as well, in business firms. Yeah, Jabe is right. There's a mismatch in the constraints. There's a mismatch in the dynamic of the embedding and the embedded sets of constraints.
I'm suggesting that we talk about tech debt in the panel.
Yeah.
Unless Jabe might.
Yes, let Jabe explain that.
Jabe has lots to say about that.
Okay.
Very good things. Patrick was curious whether the notation that Moreno and Mosio use, whether that is applicable, or whether you found it applicable outside of chemistry.
Oh, I would think so. I clearly would say that image I have with the oval that closes and becomes a hypercycle meta constraint on the component parts, absolutely. You've got the administration council at a university. That's the closure of that constraint. That's going to keep going. And in a sense, that is what the culture of an organization does. The culture of an organization can survive the individuals that, in terms of which it emerged and which it controls. The embedding context is always longer lived. Usually it's slower, and absolutely the culture of an organization can outlive, even if everybody quits and resigns, the culture can often survive even when the next set of people get hired. It's very insidious that way. In a sense, it's good because the overall set of constraints provides a stabilizing regime that ensures that the system can persist over a long period of time. You have to have that overarching metastable persistence for an institution to last. But on the reverse of it is it can become very pernicious, and it'll just entrench. It becomes not only enabling and constitutive, it becomes entrenched, and it freezes the overall system, which means it overfits, and therefore it isn't responsive to context any longer.